It's a great honor for me to actually speak with you this morning about a topic I feel so passionate about. 2018 marked the 50th anniversary of the Bertrand Russell collection coming to McMaster. And the anniversary was heralded by McMaster and by the large community of Russell scholars around the world. And this talk synthesizes some of my more significant reflections from that year. So I've set myself 3 objectives for this talk for you this morning. First, to answer the #1 question we received throughout the 50-year anniversary, and we continue to receive it today. How did the papers of the 20th century's most famous philosopher, mathematician, and peace activist ever find their way to McMaster? Second, to delve into the impact that this extraordinary collection has had on the library and on the university, and in a way to explain to you how major archival collections grow over time. And finally, I'm intending to offer some reflections on why archival collections continue to matter, and this collection in particular, in an age of Twitter and Facebook and 24-hour news feeds, where sensationalism tends to reign supreme and more thoughtful work sometimes fails to find an audience. And in doing so, I hope to incorporate a little mystery and intrigue, because everyone needs mystery and intrigue on a Wednesday morning. And I hope you'll also walk away with a little bit of pride of your community and the role that it plays in the literary life of Canada and the world. And I also hope that I'll encourage you to think a little bit more deeply about the role of primary research in both understanding the present and preparing for the future. So that's my plan. So first, who was Bertrand Russell? How many people remember Bertrand Russell very clearly? A fair number of you? Okay, so I'm going to walk you a little bit through history here, just to give you a little bit of a reminder. So Bertie, as he was known by his family and by many of his close friends, he was the grandson of the British Prime Minister, Lord John Russell. And he was born into the British aristocracy. He looks quite aristocratic, does he not? And he held the title of the Right Honourable the Earl Russell. But his family was of shockingly liberal attitudes. His mother had an affair with his own tutor with his father's consent. Think about that. Both of his parents were strong proponents of birth control at a time when that was simply not accepted. And when both of Bertie's parents died and he was quite young, his grandmother petitioned the courts in England to have him and his siblings raised as agnostics. Think about that. So we will see this non-traditional upbringing emerge in the man that Bertie would become. Are there any mathematicians in the crowd here? Any math teachers, perhaps a mathematics professor? You're all afraid that I'm going to ask you to interpret this. I am not a mathematician. And so I will not try and explain to you Russell's paradox or the key concepts of his 3-volume Principia Mathematica written with Alfred North Whitehead. Principia and his earlier work, The Principles of Mathematics, made Russell world famous in this field. And at the end of his life, when people asked him what was his major contribution to humanity, he actually said it was his work in mathematics. But Russell was actually the founding father of analytic philosophy, or at least one of the 2 or 3. And analytic philosophy became the dominant form of philosophy beginning in the early 20th century. And analytic philosophy emphasizes clarity and precision. And it often uses formal logic and in some cases mathematics, which of course was what attracted Bertrand to the field. And analytic philosophers like Bertrand Russell try to solve the big philosophical questions of the day by analyzing the terms used to describe them. And Russell wrote heavily in the areas of metaphysics and ethics, the philosophy of mathematics, ethics, and epistemology. This is where things start to get a little bit more interesting, because Russell, of course, for those of you who remember him, did not shy away from controversy. He publicly disclosed his disdain for formal religion, a fact that did not go over very well at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he held a lectureship. In fact, he lost the opportunity of a fellowship because of his unwillingness to even pretend to be a practicing Christian. His book, Marriage and Morals, questioned Victorian notions of fidelity in marriage. It questioned monogamy. And he was an early champion of free love at a time when most people would not even know what that term meant. I should note as well that Bertie had 4 wives and a countless number of mistresses. He was an active supporter of the Homosexual Law Reform Society. He supported women's suffrage, racial equality, and intermarriage. You can imagine how that would have played in the time. He believed that divorces should be easy to get if there were no children. All very controversial ideas for the time. But some would say that Russell was at his best as a social critic. He took a razor-sharp approach to life, and his writing was impeccable. It was precise. Remember, he's a mathematician. But he was also incredibly witty. He had a way of cutting sentences that surprised the reader. One of the symptoms of an approaching nervous breakdown is the belief that one's work is terribly important. That's a very memorable Russell quote. The secret to happiness is to face the fact that the world is horrible. And for the bibliophiles in the crowd, this is my personal favorite. There are 2 motives for reading a book. One, that you enjoy it. The other, that you can boast about it. But it was Russell's advocacy for peace and social reform that elevated him to global fame. During World War I, Russell was an active pacifist, a very dangerous position to take in 1914. In 1914, he was actually convicted under the Defense of the Realm Act for publishing a pamphlet that criticized the harsh treatment of conscientious objectors in the UK. And he was fined £100, but he refused to pay. Remember, he's an aristocrat, hoping that he would be sent to prison. Now, unfortunately, his friends paid his fine by selling some of his books and furniture without his knowledge. Now, I understand he was quite tickled by the fact afterwards when his own personal Bible came back stamped, property of the Cambridge Police. That was really pleasing to him. But he was dismissed from his teaching position at Trinity as a result of that charge. But good news for Bertie, in 1918, he got his wish. He was sent to Brixton Prison for 6 months because of an editorial he wrote criticizing the UK's actions in the war. But if you read this letter, which comes from the McMaster collections, it'll become clear that Bertie did not really suffer too much in prison. Here you see the first letter that Russell wrote from prison to the governor asking for some extra comforts. He wanted a private room. He wanted his own books, his own newspapers, and even his own furniture brought in. And later in life, Bertie wrote, "I found prison in many ways to be quite agreeable. I had no engagements. I had no difficult decisions to make. No fear of callers," I like that one. "No interruptions to my work. I read enormously. I wrote a book, Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy." Now, being Russell, he eventually sent the prison warden a copy of that book with a note of thanks. I'm not sure what the prison warden would have done with a book about the mathematics of philosophy, but Russell had made his point. And I should note that Russell spent another 7 days in Brixton prison in 1961 at the ripe young age of 89 for breach of the peace, after taking part in an anti-nuclear demonstration in London. And the judge offered to exempt him from the charge if he pledged to good behavior, to which he replied, "No, I won't." So in 1962, at the age of 90, Russell played a major role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He engaged in regular correspondence with both Khrushchev and JFK. And Khrushchev promised him at one point that the Soviet government would not be reckless. And here's a telegram that Russell sent to JFK that traveled around the world. "Your action desperate, threat to human survival, no conceivable justification. Civilized man condemns it. We will not have mass murder. Ultimatums mean war. End this madness." So Russell saw the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and the threat of nuclear weapons as putting the entire human race at risk. In July 1955, the Russell-Einstein Manifesto was issued by Russell in London. And the document, which called for immediate nuclear disarmament, was signed by 11 of the most prominent nuclear physicists and intellectuals of the time, including Einstein. And the manifesto called for a conference where scientists would assess the dangers of weapons. And one key phrase is often quoted: "Remember your humanity and forget the rest." Now, in 1966, Russell constituted the International War Crime Tribunal, which is often called the Russell Tribunal. And the purpose of the tribunal was to raise awareness about the impact of the war on Vietnamese citizens. He brought together 25 internationally recognized academics, scientists, and peace activists. Many of them were Nobel laureates, to help bring an end to the war. And the tribunal, which had no legal authority, eventually declared the U.S. guilty of all charges, including mass genocide. So Russell was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1950 for his prolific writings championing human rights and freedom of thought. And his Peace Prize and his citation are two of the most treasured items in our collection. But Russell's life brought him into contact with some of the most significant individuals in the 20th century. We have letters to and from Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Albert Einstein, Muhammad Ali, Aldous Huxley, and many, many more. People recognize this face. Russell met with Paul McCartney in the 1960s to explain the evils of the Vietnam War to him. And Paul has been quite open since about the fact that a very small British philosopher introduced him and ultimately the Beatles to the anti-war movement. And here's how he describes this meeting. "He just clued me into the fact that Vietnam was a very bad war. It was an imperialist war, and America vested interests were really all it was about. It was a bad war, and we should be against it. That was all. It was pretty good from the mouth of a great philosopher. Slip it to me, Bert." I'm not sure what the "slip it to me, Bert" really meant, but that's Paul. John Lennon and Yoko Ono became very strong supporters of Russell, and in 1969, he received this Christmas card from John and Yoko. The card resides in our collections, and some years ago, we actually, with the permission of Yoko Ono, we reproduced this card and sent it out as the library's holiday card. And we sent out about 1,000 of them to our various friends and donors of the library, and we received 3 of them back in the mail from very kind souls who said they seemed to have inadvertently received this card that was meant for someone by the name of Bertrand Russell. So now, in some ways, we come to the crux of my presentation. How did the collection of this extraordinary world figure come to McMaster? This question has come up repeatedly over the last year and was, of course, a big interest at the time. And as with many things in life, the issue came down to money. So Russell was coming to the very end of his life, and he felt that he had enough money to survive and live very comfortably, but he needed funds to continue his political legacy after he died. And so in 1963, he established the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation as a vehicle to further his political agenda after his death. And the foundation needed large amounts of money to carry on their work running those international war tribunals. Note that these tribunals were not government bodies. They needed to be funded privately. And Russell decided he had one thing of value that he could sell and make an awful lot of money: his papers. Now, I'm going to note just a few things here before we go further in the story. First, Russell's papers were absolutely massive. He wrote, well, how many letters do you think Russell would have written in his life? Can someone give me a number? Thousands. A more precise number? Well, 10,000. 50,000. Bertrand Russell wrote 50,000 letters. He would write 3 and 4 letters in an afternoon to one of his mistresses. And each of those letters, each of those 50,000 letters is at McMaster. 25,000 documents that Bertrand Russell wrote over his close to 100 years. Now, second, it's important for you to know that Russell was very, very concerned that he not be seen as profiteering from this sale. He wanted the transaction to be done in such a way that the money was moving over to the Peace Foundation so that it was clear to the whole world that he wasn't making the money himself. And so he actually donated the entire collection to the Peace Foundation, and they set up a private company called Continuum One that actually arranged the sale. So he distanced himself from it. But finally, the rules for this sale were very clear and were focused on ensuring that his archive would always be available to the world. Number one, the collection must stay together. He wasn't allowing the sale to break all those letters up to be sold individually, even though that would have raised more money. And second, the collection must go to an institution where the world would be able to come and see it. So needless to say, the world was abuzz. Where was this collection going to go? Which of the major archives would win the bid? Would it be Harvard or Princeton? Funny, no one mentioned McMaster. We were a very small campus of mostly undergraduate students at the time, mostly the kids of blue-collar families in the city. And Maclean's did a review of McMaster in 1967 and said we were a no-nonsense university whose students tended to be solemn, working-class kids eager for upward mobility. And we had only recently divested ourselves as a Baptist university to become a public institution. We had only really been public institution. In other words, we could only get grants from the government to run for about 10 years. And we were pretty much unknown internationally. And the money was starting to get a little bit tight. So what possible right did we have to make a play for the biggest, arguably the most expensive research collection to ever come on the market? And think a little bit about this as a juxtaposition. Are you thinking about this? McMaster had the first research nuclear reactor on a university campus in the Commonwealth, but we were thinking of bidding on the papers of the world's most prominent spokesperson for the anti-nuclear. So it's an interesting situation. But I would suggest that there are 2 key players. And the first one was this gentleman right here, Harry Cody. And I'm sure many people in the room knew Harry Cody. He was McMaster's president from 1961 to 1972. And Thode and his trusted advisors were ready to turn McMaster's tradition of undergraduate education on its head. Thode wanted focused excellence. He didn't want just meandering general growth. He wanted to compete with the big guys in research and graduate study. And he initially focused his attention on the physical and engineering sciences because, of course, he was himself a nuclear chemist. And he worked tirelessly to put McMaster on the map by bringing that nuclear reactor to campus. So this is where the story gets interesting. Thode had succeeded in putting the sciences on the map with the arrival of the nuclear reactor. He was now searching for a way to do the same thing for the arts. What idea emerged on the horizon? That's right. The papers of the 3rd Earl Russell, our own Bertie. And as Nick Griffin reported in a 2004 article, the archives became the institutional equivalent of the nuclear reactor. Now, Thode couldn't do this on his own. The idea needed a catalyst. And that catalyst was a gentleman I'm guessing most of you have never heard of, but who is actually central to our story. So this is Dr. Will Reedy. He would be my predecessor's predecessor's predecessor. He was university librarian from 1965 to 1978, and he was no ordinary librarian. Many have called him the Buccaneer librarian. Some might think that's an unusual juxtaposition of terms. He had a huge amount of autonomy and a clear disinterest for rules. He even described himself as cavalier and headlong. He was known for walking into a rare bookshop in England somewhere and saying, "How much for everything?" I can assure you that I would be fired quite quickly for doing many of the things that Will did every day. And he had very recently moved from Marquette University to McMaster, and he was very eager to make his name. Now, Reedy had heard about the papers becoming available by accident during a visit to Britain in fall 1967. And Will, in character, started moving very, very aggressively to acquire them. He wasn't the type of person that would just wait around and strike a committee to think about what the university should do. He just moved. So he went directly to Thode's office, and he got his permission to move ahead to make a bid for this extraordinary collection. Now, I will say that there are other universities, even here in Canada. One of them just down the highway from us also wanted this collection badly and might have been able to make a pretty strong argument that they were the ones to get it. But they dilly-dallied too long and could not put forward an offer. Instead, they found themselves supporting a proposal by little old McMaster to have the collection come here. And by December, Reedy had applied for and actually raised $150,000 from the Canada Council. But he actually needed a lot more money to do what he needed to do. But he got it. He went directly to MACA alumnus Mr. Eaton, and then he went to the Laidlaw Foundation, and he went to the Atkinson Foundation, and the whole deal was done in less than 6 months. So I'm just going to pause here for a moment, and let's think a little bit about the other big players here and what they might have thought of this. So some would say that Russell's own personal preference would have been to have his collection stay in the United Kingdom. You know, both Cambridge and the British Museum were very interested in this collection, but neither of them had the money to buy it. And Cambridge hoped that he would actually will it to them in his estate, but Russell was not a very sentimental person. Now, mind you, they had also fired him at one point, so think about that. But he needed the money, and he needed the money for his foundation, and he just wanted to move ahead. But, you know, what about all those big schools in the US, too? They were very eager to get their hands on this collection. Harvard, Berkeley, Yale, etc. were all talking about bids. There was even a plan to have Chicago and Harvard go in together to get it. Now, traditional wisdom would suggest that Bertie himself might not have wanted to sell the collection to the US because of his feelings about the US's involvement in Vietnam. But I think a more recent scholarship has determined that A, Bertie wasn't that sentimental, but more importantly, those universities in 1968 were hotbeds of revolutionary notions, and he might have actually enjoyed that. So I don't think that was his concern. But the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas, Austin, was absolutely desperate for this collection. And they had tons and tons of money. But their bid was ruined by a scandalous article which appeared in Newsweek magazine. So sometime that fall, a story ran in the magazine that suggested that Russell was selling his papers and was going to give all the money to North Vietnam. Now, Russell, as you can imagine, was furious. He was absolutely furious. And so his lawyers actually got the issues pulled from the stands in Britain. But the damage had been done, and Texas had to withdraw from the negotiations, and the whole thing fell apart. And it actually appears that the magazine was somehow set up. They were duped by someone, or some organization that wanted to stop the sale. We don't know whether it was the American government that actually wanted to stop his collection from coming into the US. We don't know whether it was possibly taxpayers in the US, in Texas, that really didn't want their taxpayer money being spent on this person. But the result is that the papers became unsaleable in the US. They just couldn't go there. And that allowed Will Reedy to step in and claim the prize. So by hook or by crook, Reedy raises all the money, $500,000 in less than 6 months, and the collection arrives at McMaster. And the story of the purchase, as you can imagine, made headlines around the world. This photo shows Dr. Ken Blackwell. He was 25 years old then, the Russell archivist. He had actually worked with Russell in the UK, and he came with the collection. He always tells us he got his own seat on the plane, though. And he said, I was 25 at the time, and I was interviewed all over the place. So people got to know where McMaster was through the archives. It put McMaster on the map. So the issue of the collection leaving the country, it erupted in British Parliament. And with at least one speaker suggesting that the export of those papers was a scandal and it was a disgrace. And the sale eventually resulted in changes to the UK export laws. And the decision was honestly not universally endorsed here in Hamilton. Some administrators feared criticism for being associated with such a controversial figure. And to be safe, the university insisted that they not purchase the collection even directly from the foundation. They wanted it known that they purchased it from this third party, this Continuum One corporation, just to distance themselves. And the huge cost, $500,000, turned into a scandal itself. Keep in mind, if you use an inflator, that's $3.6 million in 2019. The day after the sale, The Observer published an article speculating on the price, which was supposed to have been secret, and suggesting that it was a world record sum. The article also suggested that the money had gone to Russell personally. And again, this was terrible. This was absolutely infuriated Russell. But who leaked this story? We'll never know for sure, but there is some talk, there's some speculation that it was Will Reedy. And that there is speculation that he actually leaked the deal out of some sense of excitement. And this is certainly what Russell believed, but we'll never know for sure. So there's no question in my mind that the acquisition of the Russell collection has been a game changer for the university and for the research community. It's no exaggeration to say that the Russell collection laid the foundation for McMaster University Library to become one of Canada's preeminent archival collections. Some of our collections, for example, 18th century fiction, are the best in Canada. In other cases, we're second only to the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Collection in Toronto, and in other cases, our collections are identified as the best in the world. So the building of an archive is a curatorial task, with each acquisition building on the ones that came before it. And in the archive, we very carefully select which archives to go after. And given the maturity of our collections, we have several foci. So McMaster's collections are heavy in the areas of Canadian literature, Canadian music. We have very rich collections in peace and war. And these collections are built through relationships. In days gone by, we actually paid for archives, so they paid for the Russell Archive. But now most of our collections come in through donation. And we have to convince an author or a musician or a public figure that we can help steward their materials and reveal them to the world. And they're compelled to choose McMaster over other archives because of the strength of our existing collections. They want their collection to be associated with the other great figures that they themselves admire. So in 1971, we purchased the first collection of Ms. Vera Britton's papers. She's just an incredible woman. She was a writer, a lecturer, a pacifist, a feminist, and her autobiographical work, Testament of Youth, was recently made into a very good feature film, and her work fit beautifully with that of Russell. We acquired Anthony Burgess's original manuscript of Clockwork Orange for $250, I should say. The original manuscript we got for $250. A first edition, just a regular first edition right now, is worth about $15,000. The manuscript is priceless. An article in the National Post reported that the relationship with Burgess was, quote, forged by flattery and crucially the university's checkbook, but later turned on friendship. And that's ultimately where we want to be. We also acquired some of the Irish author and playwright Samuel Beckett's papers, which are very heavily used. In 1970, we made headlines with the acquisition of Farley Mowatt's extensive archive. And Mowat shared Russell's anti-war sentiments, as well as his willingness to get in a bit of trouble along the way. And his collection, again, is absolutely massive and heavily used today. Pierre Burton's papers came in 1974. Margaret Lawrence's papers came in 1982. Both are very rich archives with heavy use by scholars across Canada and, in Lawrence's case, around the world. Now, acquiring the archives of Canada's great publishing houses was a brilliant stroke. McMaster houses the largest and most varied collections of archives on Canadian publishing, which include, among others, the records of McClelland and Stewart, Macmillan Canada, Key Porter Books, and with those archives came the archives of some of Canada's most well-known and flamboyant publishers, Jack McClelland, Anna Porter. Our music archives are, again, one of the best and most varied in Canada. We hold the papers of the incomparable pianist Valerie Tryon, conductor Boris Brott. In more recent years, we've taken in the papers of jazz great Jackie Washington, Ian Thomas, Bruce Coburn. Coburn's collection of notebooks are particularly heavily used by musicologists and fans alike. We have a few of Jackie's favorite guitars, and we have the purple suit that Ian Thomas wore in the 1980s, very popular. And we're building very good collections of Indigenous archives. We held the papers of Pauline Johnson for many years, and a few years ago we took in the papers of renowned Ojibwe author and teacher Basil Johnson. And more recently we added McMaster's own Henry Giroux's papers to our collection. Henry is, of course, one of Canada's more prolific and prominent scholars. And just last year, we celebrated the addition of our newest author to McMaster, the papers of one of Canada's great storytellers, humorists, and radio broadcasters, and just a genuinely nice man, Stuart McLean. And he came to us in part because of his admiration of Farley Mowat. So McMaster University Library has one of the most aggressive archival acquisition programs in the country. We actively seek out new donations to build up upon our strengths, but that strength, at its core, grew out of the Russell acquisition. I'd like to focus on why archives, and this archive in particular, is so critically important. So how many people in the room have ever visited an archive or done archival research? So a sprinkling of you, that's great. And if you have, you'll know that archival research is hard work. It's time consuming. And although more and more archival material is becoming available digitally, researchers still typically have to visit the collection in person. And they must typically travel to get to that place. And then once they get there, there's lots of rules. You have to use a pencil. In some cases, you can't take photographs of what you're seeing. And the finding aids are not that deep, so you actually have to work with an archivist sometimes to really get what you want. And you often have to sift through hundreds and hundreds of documents to find that critical piece. So how can archival research, which sounds so hard, still be relevant in this age of social media and sound bites and 24-hour news cycles? And the answer is that archival research is actually more relevant and more vital now because our access to the truth sometimes seems so ephemeral. And our reading rooms in the archive are actually more busy now than they have ever been in the past. And entire classes are being brought in by their instructors so that students can have an opportunity to actually touch original materials hands-on. And scholars come from around the world to use our collections. And for a large number of researchers, of all ages I'll say, the concept of visiting a place to actually see original material is quite breathtaking. And they love to discover things that nobody has possibly seen for 50 or 70 or 100 years or 300 years. And when they find something of value, they feel this sudden desire to cheer in the middle of the archive's reading room. And it's wonderful, and we've grown to expect it. So they don't get in trouble. It's great. But I will say, we use social media to get the word out. And so during our anniversary year, the Russell Research Center actually published the 104 letters that Russell was able to get out while he was in prison. And they published them on the anniversary of the day he sent that letter out. And we posted them on Facebook and Twitter, and the take-up was phenomenal. So social media becomes a conduit to get to the archive. But I believe it's really the fullness of the archival collection that's critical. You know, books and articles about a person's life provide a very single lens. But the lens is determined by the author of the book. And they filter out the bits that they think are important, and they push those bits to the front. And in doing so, they construct their own image and their own perspective of who that person was for your consideration. And the sources that they've used are sometimes there in the references, but the filtering has already happened. But the well-constructed archive, on the other hand, presents the raw data of the person's life. And the archivist will arrange all of that information, all those thousands and thousands of letters, in such a way that those items can be found again, but the lens on that person's life is not preset. It's there for you to choose. So in some ways, you're given a finding aid into the archive, but the journey is yours. And a good archive, I will say, is not curated by the subject. In other words, when we take in, say, Farley Mowat's archive, and he was in the middle of his career, he doesn't get to determine what pieces get put where and which items make it into the collection. That's done by the archive. And that's very important. It's not a vanity experience. A good archive includes the totality of the person's life, the warts and all piece. And that's what we work on with our donors. We don't want a sanitized version of their life. We want to see their whole life. So they give us everything. Their grocery store slips. We get it all. But as an aside, sometimes when we work with a donor, they ask us to embargo certain items. And sometimes it's 10 years after the death of my spouse, or something of that nature, and that's wonderful. There are embargoes, for example, on Farley Mowat's archive. But it's the fact that the full set of material is there that's important. And I recall very well a meeting with Stuart McLean before he passed away. And he wanted us to have everything. And in typical Stuart McLean fashion, he loved the works. He loved the little flaws and foibles of his own life. He took great pleasure in showing me his report cards from grade school where he got terrible marks in English and was told by his teacher he was never going to amount to anything unless he started working harder. And that was wonderful, and that's really important. And I will also say that many of the musicians and the writers whose archives we hold have had challenging lives. And those lives are filled with bits of self-doubt and financial ruin and bad decisions and missed opportunities. But the material is all there, and it hasn't been sanitized. And that's really where the wonderful bits are. Now, Russell's archive in particular, coming to the close here, is particularly important. So much so that last year we relocated the archive and the Bertrand Russell Research Center to a new location on Forsyth. It just looks right across from Mills Library. And that's Ken Blackwell in the far right. Do you remember the archivist who was 25 years old when the archive came? And he still comes to work every day. He is a volunteer. He has an actual title as the honorary archivist. And he continues to work for the Research Center and to answer very challenging questions that no one else can answer but Ken. And it's also important to note that we actually purchased another collection of material this year from the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation. This material directly related to those international war tribunals. The reality is that the threat of nuclear war continues. Many countries either are or are thought to have nuclear capabilities. And there have been over 2,000 detonations for testing purposes. So the concern has shifted a bit, and now the concern is around the use of nuclear power for terrorism. But the problem is still very much with us, and so the importance of Bertrand Russell's work still remains. And I'm happy to report that Russell's scholarship is thriving. The Russell Journal, published here at McMaster through the Bertrand Russell Research Center, has been in operation for 46 years, with subscribers around the world. And 17 volumes of the collected papers have been published to date, with another probably 17 or more to come. And the Russell Society gathers every year in a different part of the world so that scholars can come together and work on their pieces. And as we move into new modes of scholarship, digital scholarship, textual analysis, you can imagine how the work on a gigantic corpus of material will continue for generations to come. But in my opinion, it's Russell's words that live on so many years after his death. And Russell still has a presence in popular culture. There is no end to the number of fridge magnets, coffee mugs, comic books that you can purchase with Bertrand Russell's images and quotes on them. And I think we've seen some of those wonderful quotes. His turn of the English language is quite incredible. But what about Russell himself? Near the end of his own life, he was asked about his own contribution, and he suggested that his own life was trivial and unworthy of scholarly activity, at least compared to the continued existence of the human race. But of course, who can compete with the continued existence of the human race? Ultimately, I believe it's his embracing of the radical life which continues to captivate us, and his astounding use of the English language to describe his journey that helps his work to remain pertinent today. Henry Giroux said it best. He said his life, his writing, his actions all show a moral courage that should inspire us. And he provides a model of what it means to talk back and to scorn easy popularity and refuse to accept the comfortable life. And in doing so, he actually honored the three passions that governed his entire life: the longing for love, the search for knowledge, and an unbearable pity for the suffering of men. So thank you so much for being so patient as I take you through 100 years of history. So I'll look forward to chatting with you after the break.